things about being director of the Northrop Frye Center is that we get to work with amazing doctoral fellows. And the next talk here today is, we've got a wonderful colleague from the Italian department. Natapol Ronzi is a PhD candidate and course instructor in the Department of Italian Studies. His doctoral thesis employs the eco-critical approach to examine Giorgio Bassani's environmental awareness and his role as a writer and environmentalist, both through his literary work and non-literary works. Topics that Natapol explores in this thesis include Bassani's representation of nature and landscape and environmental issues in his short stories and novels, as well as his concept of human, non-human from the perspective of animal studies. He's former vice president of UTGSU's Environmental Justice and Sustainability Committee, and I will also mention a passionate advocate of the minimal waste lifestyle movement. His talk today is entitled Lessons from Environmental Narratives in Post-World War II Italy. Natapol, take it away.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. And thank you, Bob and Amelia, for organizing this talk and giving me the opportunity and the venue to share my research. So this talk originates from the current and ongoing chapter of my PhD thesis. So any suggestions are very welcome. And I'll just start with sharing my screen. Okay. I hope everyone can see the slides. Okay. All right, so environmental narrative analysis is most commonly applied to works of fiction. However, non-fictional texts are also a valuable resource for analysis. And it is this category of text that I will focus on today in my talk. So first, I would like to give you a panoramic view of the Western environmental narratives that have emerged in the 20th and the 21st century. So two major categories of environmental narratives are the declensionist or pessimistic and the ascensionist or hopeful narrative. I will start my talk with the declensionist / pessimistic narrative and then turn to the environmental narratives in post-Second World War Italy. Then I will end my talk by mentioning the ascensionist and hopeful narrative. So the term declensionist might not sound familiar, but it might be the most common environmental narrative nowadays when it comes to contemporary environmental issues. In a few words, a declensionist narrative is one that emphasizes stories of decline, that is, stories of extinction, degradation, contamination, and of course, climate change. The declensionist narrative was initially deemed as a necessary reaction to a narrative that celebrated human dominion over the non-human. For some scholars, the declensionist narrative is problematic because it tends to evoke depression and some sense of guilt and despair rather than inspiring solutions to the problems. And for some, even the concept of the Anthropocene is also part of the declensionist narrative. Under the umbrella of the declensionist narrative, we may include the so-called finite Earth narrative and the apocalyptic narrative. After the Second World War, more and more stories of negative human impacts on the environment were told. There were books such as Fairfield Osborne's Our Plunder Planet, published in 1948, which was one of the earliest examples of text that portray humans as the cause of environmental destruction. And William Vaugh's Road to Survival, also published in 1948, which would inspire Rachel Carson, the author of Silent Spring. And we also have Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, published in 1968, which predicts a global famine as a consequence of overpopulation. We can say that the prominent element of stories in the finite Earth or apocalyptic narrative is the emphasis on the negative effects of human action on the Earth. Another characteristic of this narrative is the presence of villains and heroes. The role of villains is usually taken up by the likes of polluting industries and complacent governments, while on the opposite side, we have the so-called eco-warriors. We have to remember that the modern environmental movement is thought to be triggered by the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962. Actually, the 1960s was the period that built up a new environmental consciousness, which reached its peak with events like the Santa Barbara oil spill in January 1969, and resulted in the organization of the first Earth Day on April 22nd in 1970. Another element that also influenced and gave birth to the modern environmentalism is the 1960s counterculture. In fact, the Earth Day initiative was inspired by the student anti-war movement of the 1960s, and it was geared toward the energy. The initiator of the Earth Day wanted to gear that energy towards the environmentally concerned direction. So within this new pro-environment momentum, the villainous and the heroic roles that I mentioned earlier were solidified in the narrative. This type of environmentalism can also be called apocalyptic environmentalism. Up to this day, many people are drawn to the narrative that portrays human as the destructive agents who will bring the end to the world unless we completely change our behaviors. It doesn't mean that this movement is trying to say that there is no hope left for humanity. It's just that what the apocalyptic environmentalism deems as the most effective tool to call for changes is, in Kierkegaard's words, and I quote, "the fear for the coming catastrophe or collapse," end quote, rather than the picture of a bright future. I'm going to show now Greta Thunberg's special address at the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum 2019 as an example of what could be considered as an apocalyptic narrative. Right here.
We must change almost everything in our current societies. The bigger your carbon footprint is, the bigger your moral duty. The bigger your platform, the bigger your responsibility. Adults keep saying we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as if you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if the house was on fire. Because it is.
So Greta did mention hope in her speech. And what we can deduce from this is that there are some people who prefer the hopeful way of thinking about environmental issues. And this leads us to the other end of the environmental narrative spectrum, which is the optimistic or the ascensionist narrative. But we will continue with this positive narrative after I present the main part of today's talk, which is a case study of the environmental narratives in the post-Second World War Italy, which resonates with the declensionist narrative. In this section of the talk, I will introduce you to the background of environmentalism in Italy within the social and political context of the post-war period. I would then focus on the environmental narratives that were being constructed by an important environmentalist association called Italia Nostra, especially under the leadership of the novelist Giorgio Bassani as its president from 1965 to 1980. I will demonstrate that Bassani's environmental narratives are very much in line with the declensionist or the pessimistic narrative of the 1960s and 70s. But at the same time, his narratives also contain elements that are unique to the Italian historical context of the post-war period. Let's start by talking about the origins of environmentalism in Italy. While there have been many attempts to protect nature through the ages since the ancient times, I would like to start by focusing on the period around the end of the 1800s to the beginning of the 1900s. In Italy, there was this case of the pine forests in the area surrounding the city of Ravenna. These are ancient pine forests that date back to the Roman times, but during the 1800s, a vast area of the forest was cut down, and there were reclamation projects which turned the lands in the adjacent areas into farmlands. In order to raise awareness and protect the pine forest, there was an attempt to emphasize their literary and historical significance. For example, Boccaccio, in the 8th story of the 5th day of the Decameron, tells a tale of Nastagio degli Onesti, who one day went into the pine forest of Ravenna and saw a scene of the ghost of a knight hunting and killing his lover for not accepting his love when they were alive. Nastagio, who also suffered from unrequited love, invited his lover to the pine forest to witness the reenactment of the scene and successfully convinced her to marry him. Dante also mentions the pine forest of Ravenna in Canto 28 of the Purgatory. The poet draws inspiration to describe the earthly paradise in this canto from the image of this pine forest. The pine forest is also historically important because Giuseppe Garibaldi, the hero of the Italian unification, escaped the Austrian army from Rome to San Marino and arrived in this area where his wife, Anita, died, probably of malaria. The attempt to protect the pine forest of Ravenna is therefore part of this first environmental movement in Italy. Looking from the environmental narrative perspective, we can see that the case of the pine forest of Ravenna establishes the legitimacy of the conservationist attempts by emphasizing the historical, literary, and aesthetic value of the forest. And this is a pattern that will be repeated, although in a different way, by the environmental movement of the post-war period. So the first period of the environmental movement in Italy between the end of the 1800s and 1900s was followed by the Ventennio Fascista, or the 20 years of the fascist regime that starts in 1922 and lasts until 1943. It was a period in which we see pioneers of the first environmental movement who were born between the 1850s and the 1870s, either died or gradually became less influential in the academic or political spheres. Many of these pioneers belong to the leftist political wing, and so during the fascist period, they encountered many obstacles in their environmental conservation works. Therefore, in this period, the environmentalist movement became much less alive. Due to the policy of achieving self-sufficient and independent economy, the fascist era was also a period in which we witnessed a lot of deforestation and, arguably, most importantly, land reclamation projects to increase lands that can be used for agriculture. One thing that we have to understand is that the practice of land reclamation was not invented during the fascist period. Since the ancient times, the inhabitants of the Italian peninsula have always been struggling with excessive water. While rivers are beneficial for trading and transportation, they also cause flood and create malaria-infested wetlands. While projects of land reclamation can be found since the Roman times, during the Fascist period, land reclamation was placed at the center of Fascist environmental politics and narratives, and for some people became inevitably associated with the Fascist ideology. One of the most well-known case is the land reclamation of the Pontine marshes near Rome. Here on the left, we can see how the marshes looks like before the reclamation. And on the right, we see a photo of Pontinia, a town built on the reclaimed land. I find very interesting the topic of fascist environmental policies and the connection with the rhetoric of purification of the nation. In a few words, the physical redemption of the land through land reclamation of the malaria-inflicted swamplands and the transformation of these lands into arable areas reflects the fascist attempt to redeem the Italian society from racial impurities, which, as we know, led to the promulgation of the anti-Jewish racial law in 1938. Therefore, we can say that although land reclamation in the Italian peninsula did not just start during the fascist rule, it is during this period that it became a political instrument and acquired a symbolic meaning that reached beyond its agricultural sphere and represented the fascist ideology. In the immediate post-war period, the Italian government's main objective was to promote reconstruction programs and boost the economy of the nation. Their aim was greatly supported by the US-funded European Recovery Program, or the Marshall Plan, until 1951. Italy at the beginning of the 1960s was also living a period of an economic miracle. From a predominantly agricultural country that it had been in the previous centuries, Italy in the mid-20th century saw exponential industrialization, rapid growth in urban development and housing construction, and the rise of consumerism. At the same time, the effects of industrialization and general development of the country also became more radical. The abrupt change in the way of life and the physical transformation of the urban and natural landscape became the theme of many literary and cinematic works. For example, we have Italo Calvino's novellas La Speculazione Edilizia, or the plunge into real estate, from 1957. Calvino also wrote Marco Valdo, a series of short stories written from the early 1950s to mid-1960s, depicting the mid-century transformation of Italy and its consequences, which is pollution and consumerism. We also have Michelangelo Antonioni's film Red Desert from 1964 with its iconic industrial landscape, and Pier Paolo Pasolini's films from the 1960s, like Teorema from 1968, also depict this period of transitions in the way of life and the struggle of individuals who are caught up in the process. From this, we can see that in the post-war period, the environment as focal topic was gaining broader circulation, especially among intellectuals, each of whom has their own approach to dealing with the changes they were witnessing. And one of the intellectuals who are involved with environmental issues is the novelist Giorgio Bassani, who is the focus of our talk today. While he was best known as a writer of many award-winning novels, he was also a relentless environmentalist. He started his career as a writer in the 1930s, but he gained prominence from novels written in the 1950s and 60s, such as Cinque Storie Ferraresi, or Five Stories of Ferrara from 1956, and Il Giardino dei Finzi-Contini, or The Garden of the Finzi-Contini, from 1962. These novels portray the life of the Italian Jews under the racial laws and fascist persecutions during the Second World War. Along with his success as a writer, he also started to build another path of his life as an environmentalist. In 1955, he was a co-founder of an environmental association, Italia Nostra. This association's objective is to protect Italy's historical and natural heritage. 10 years after its foundation, Bassani became the third president of this association. And he remained in this position for 15 years and thus was the longest serving president of Italia Nostra. While there are elements in his novels that reflect to some degree the environmental concerns of the 50s and 60s, it is his non-literary writings while he was Italia Nostra's president that could best shed light on his environmental awareness. I mentioned earlier that he was the longest serving president of Italia Nostra. Therefore, we can say that during the 15 years period from 1965 to 1980, his voice inevitably represented the voice of this association. The narrative that he employed in his writings during this time pretty much shaped the ideology of the association, and he became one of the most influential figures in the Italian environmentalist scene at the time. Now we'll focus on the environmental narratives that Bassani employed in his non-literary writings from this period. I will demonstrate that while his narratives align with the narrative trend that was circulating outside of Italy in the same period, Bassani was aware of the historical and social context of his country, and thus created narratives that resonate with the contemporary zeitgeist. First of all, I'll just mention the characteristics of these writings. They are collected in a volume entitled Italia da Salvare, Scritti Civili e Battaglie Ambientali, or Italy to be Saved, or Saving Italy, Civil Writings and Environmental Battles, published for the first time in 2005 and republished in 2018 with a different title, Italia da Salvare, Gli anni della presidenza di Italia Nostra, or the years of the presidency of Italia Nostra. Many of these writings included in this volume were in fact transcriptions of Bassani's speeches at conferences, in interviews, and letters. Therefore, what we will analyze is not necessarily writings in the traditional sense of works originally written to be published in a single volume. However, in the late 1990s, Bassani did desire to have these transcriptions collected and published as a book. He asked his daughter to conduct this task, and the result is this published volume. Given the different origins and nature of the text included in this book, I would just simply refer to them as texts or writings. As I mentioned earlier, I find that the narratives employed by Bassani in these texts more or less resonate with the environmental narratives outside of Italy in the post-war period. That is the declensionist narrative, which is populated with the depiction of environmental degradation, and is also often characterized by a distinction of heroes and villains. We don't have clear evidence that Bassani was aware or read the books like Carson's Silent Spring or other similar books published after the Second World War. A quick review of the list of books in Bassani's libraries didn't give me any possible source of environmental narratives from North America. However, Bassani could very well have learned about the environmental movement outside of Italy from the news. But I would argue that the social climate of Italy in the 1950s and 60s alone could have influenced Bassani's tone and narrative in his environment-related texts. Coming back to the similarities of Bassani's narratives to those in the broader context of the post-war period, we have examples of texts that emphasize the negative impact of industrialization and uncontrolled land development that was inflicted on the Italian landscape. In the first quote here, Bassani admits that he was extremely pessimistic about the fate of Sassi di Matera. He compared it to the degradation around the Venice Lagoon. And for him, the case of Matera is hopeless because if even Venice couldn't be saved, no other place could be. He also commented that unless a miracle happened, Venice will not be saved. And in this quote, Bassani basically says that without legislation to protect historical town centers, they will soon encounter a crisis of urban development and won't survive. Another characteristic of Bassani's environmental narratives that is in line with the general narrative of the post-war period is the distinction between heroes and villains. Bassani, as president of Italia Nostra, tried to protect historical and natural heritage, both by acting as a pressure group and by promoting activities like photo exhibitions to raise public awareness of the environmental issues. Therefore, understandably, the role of heroes is given to those who try to slow down the changes brought about by the economic growth and industrialization, and more specifically to Italia Nostra, while the role of villains is assigned to the agents of such transformation, most often the industrialists, speculators in the building sector, and politicians. My examples from the text will focus more on the role of the heroes because it also demonstrates how Bassani's narrative is a product of particular historical and social context of post-war Italy. Let's take a look at this quote. Bassani called members of Italia Nostra libere lance partigiani, ma chissà, reclute volontarie della cultura. So libere lance literally means freelance or mercenary. And with the term partigiani, Bassani refers to the members of the resistance movement against the fascist regime. Similarly, the term maquisard also refers to the members of the resistance movement in France during the German occupation. And the word recluta can be translated to recruit, and thus refers to a newly enlisted member of the armed forces. So with these terms, it is clear that Bassani tries to depict members of Italia Nostra as a sort of eco-warriors. And this is part of the vocabulary that I think sets Bassani's narrative apart from the general declensionist narrative of the time. I argue that Bassani was trying to create a war for the environment narrative. Other examples of vocabulary that he used in this narrative are, first of all, nouns like battaglia, battle, and guerra, war, which describe the activities of Italia Nostra. Then we have verbs like battagliare, battersi, combattere, and lottare, which are synonyms meaning to battle or to fight, and other verbs like mobilitare, to mobilize, and gridare all'allarme, to sound or call for alarm or sound the alarm. The paragraphs quoted here contain some of these terms, but I'm afraid I have to skip them due to the time limit. For me, it is not a coincidence that Bassani chose this rhetoric to describe the activities and activism of Italia Nostra. Bassani himself was an anti-fascist militant in the resistance and was even arrested in May 1943. The founders of Italia Nostra were either anti-fascist or related in some ways to the resistance movement. Before Bassani, the first two presidents of the association were also anti-fascist. Therefore, it is not a surprise that Bassani proposed a sort of parallelism between the partigiani who fought against the authoritarian regime and the environmentalists of Italia Nostra who also fought against the new enemies, which are the industrialists and politicians, whose exploitation of the land can be equated to the fascist large-scale land reclamation and deforestation. Bassani's war for the environment narrative seems to be an appropriate choice. The perception of the resistance movement as a common or default experience of the entire country started to form in the 1960s and remained as the official historiography for at least 3 decades before the legitimacy of the myth of the resistance movement started to be questioned in the 90s. Taking all this in mind, Bassani seems to have done a good job at creating a compelling environmental narrative that resonates with the political and social climate of post-war Italy. Now, I would like to introduce you to a new trend in environmental narrative of the 21st century, and I will conclude my talk with a discussion on the lessons that we could learn from Bassani's post-war environmental narrative. Since the 1990s, the pessimistic / declensionist narrative has been increasingly criticized, mainly for its being reductive, simplistic, and unable to become compelling enough to inspire changes. There's been a call for a new environmental narrative to counter the dominant pessimistic or declensionist one. This new narrative foregrounds hopeful or ascending narrative lines and is considered a necessary alternative to the pessimistic one. There are attempts by academics, scientists, and environmentalists to counterweight the pessimistic environmental narratives with ones that promote hopeful messages. The focus is on hope. This narrative believes that hope and not depression caused by the pessimistic narrative is the tool that will inspire cooperation that will lead to changes and restoration of the environment. Like the declensionist narrative, the Ascensionist narrative can act as an umbrella term for other optimistic narratives. I will talk about one particular narrative called the Recoverable Earth narrative. To summarize what the Recoverable Earth narrative offers as a new environmental narrative, I would like to start by quoting Professor Paul Jepson in his 2019 article. According to him, Recoverable Earth narrative suggests that, and I quote, rather than beating ourselves up for the harm we have inflicted on our planet, we can work with the forces of nature and within the constraints of society to recover the biosphere and through this, find new meaning and purpose in our lives, end quote. The objective of this narrative is to create empowering message and to search for solutions to restore the ecological systems while acknowledging the problems and not attributing blame. From the examples of environmental narratives, whether it be the apocalyptic, the Recoverable Earth, or Bassani's War for the Environment narrative, we can see that social, cultural, and political context plays a decisive role in determining the kind of narratives that seem to be most suitable at a given time. Personally, I don't think that we have to confine ourselves to just one particular narrative. We should be open-minded and learn the benefits and drawbacks of different narratives and choose the best combination. For example, I still think that the narratives that focus on the harms that would happen to the Earth if we don't act in time still send a powerful message and a sort of wake-up call to the public in order to make them realize the urgency of the problem. But we cannot depend only on the pessimistic narrative if we want to inspire changes. A hopeful narrative might be the one that is compelling enough to for changes to happen. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Natapol. That was very, very enlightening. Okay, maybe we can stop sharing. Perfect. Okay, so we've got some time for questions or comments or complaints as usual. If anyone would like to, thankfully no one ever takes that up, and if they ever do it, hopefully it's just on me giving a talk, and I will have reaped what I sowed. But who would like to begin the questions here? I guess if I'll get started. Oh, there's Sherry. Thanks. Great. Thanks.
Go ahead, Bob.
No, I was going to give a filler question, whereas you probably have a real question.
Well, that's a bit of an assumption on your part, but I do want to thank you, Natapol. I learned so much from your talk. Environmental humanities discourses are proliferating so rapidly, so it's actually great to have an opportunity to learn a little bit more in a format that is so concise and so clearly explained. So I really appreciate it. I really just have a comment first, which is to say that your discussion of programs of land reclamation in Fascist Italy made me think, and in relation to the pine forest versus agriculture, just made me think about Respighi's Pineta di Ravenna from 1924 in a different way. And so I think maybe that particular piece of orchestral music that I have never paid very much attention to is something that I might want to think again in light of what you were saying. It makes me want to ask you in a different conversation about other sort of cultural instantiations, maybe not only literary ones that might have been reflective of these kinds of sensibilities. Not that there's an overt program to that work that relates directly to this, but the consciousness of the Italian forest seems to me to be historically really pertinent there. But I was also just thinking, in the large about what you were saying about declensionist narratives and these different models and modes of thinking about these things. My friend Alex Rating at Harvard wrote an article, and you know what? I feel like it's like 10 years ago or something like that. And it was in a musicology journal, so it was skewed in a particular disciplinary way. But I can send you a link to it if you want. It's short and easily digestible. But he was talking about the apparent ineffectiveness of these apocalyptic narratives, as you're saying. The fact that, we had been hearing, even in 2011 when he published this thing, we've been told that we need to save the earth right now for long enough that already it would seem to be too late, and that we need another mode. I'm wondering what you think, if you see any evidences in these other narratives of a kind of a mode of nostalgia that, Rating's argument was that a nostalgic understanding of the loss that we are facing because of climate change that has been wrought by human, all that stuff, is usually thought of as being escapist, backward looking, and ultimately not helpful. But he was wondering if, especially in terms of modes of artistic representation, there was some sort of possibility for cultivating emotional attachment to nature, to the land, to the environment. And in fact, he invoked that word that is not allowed in critical scholarly discourse, which is love. Is there some way in which a nostalgic discourse might cultivate our sense of love for the environment? And I feel like there's an interesting temporal tension in this, because we think of nostalgia as being backward looking, and there's something about a narrative of loss in these notions of degradation that is also backward looking. And the Ascensionist model that you propose of hopefulness seems to be a future oriented one. And I fully appreciate that you didn't settle on a sort of a one or the other binary, but I'm kind of wondering about this in between space, a kind of a temporality that looks backward, but maybe sees that as an affordance at the same time.
Yeah, thank you very much for the comment and also the question. Regarding this kind of nostalgic, or let's say the emotional or affective impact of narratives that as you said, kind of look back to what was lost. I think this is an important part actually of let's say of an effective or an efficient narrative, because the emotional effect, we cannot underestimate the emotional or affective impact of narratives to inspiring people to change their behaviors. As you said, there are the kind of backward-looking narratives or nostalgic narratives, and the more future-looking ones. But as I said in my conclusion, I still think that either ways, it's still we can always find in either kinds of narratives useful elements to inspire people to feel that changes are necessary. But then we cannot just settle on just the emotional, on just the affective impact that we got from these narratives. I think in order to go forward, we need a combination of these different narratives to guide us to the future, to guide us, to give us new ways to deal with or cope with environmental crisis. And so yeah, so I'm just saying that we cannot underestimate what can be considered as some kind of backward looking or even negative narratives, because we can always find benefits from these narratives, especially when combined with other narratives that are more probably that we can say more inspiring and more that could inspire changes and changes both in behaviors and both in the way people think about environmental problems. So I would really very much I'm very interested to read the article that you mentioned, because as I said earlier in at the beginning of my my talk, this is a still ongoing or in progress chapter, and I'm still in the process of finding let's say new approaches or new perspectives in order to look at the narratives, or to find narratives that could be a new one for people in the 21st century. And so I thank you very much for your suggestion, and if I would really I would like to discuss more with you if you if you have some time, and yeah.
Maybe Sherry, if you find that article, you can paste it to the chat.
I will do so. And Natapol, I always have time. Send me an email.
Thank you.
Yeah, before we get to Filippo and Evelyn, P. Frasca put in the chat, wondering if Bassani's work, Gender Sexuality Critiques, have a place in conversation with environmental critique. And I guess alongside that, what role grief and mourning can play in Ascensionist hopeful narratives. Those are big topics. I don't know if Natapoli want to jump on those right now or keep those in mind as we continue the discussion.
Gender sexuality, yeah. So gender and sexuality is another big topic that we can, with which we can read Bassani's novels or short stories. As of now, I'm afraid I'm not clearly seeing how, or I can say I haven't had the opportunity to see the connection of the gender and sexuality context with the environmental one, but as I said, it's one of the most common approaches to Bassani's works. And so I would very much like when I have an opportunity to do so, maybe I would see how I can connect or relate, how I can connect or see the connection between these two topics. But
that's
as of right now,
answer. Okay, let's move on to Filippo and then Evelyn, please. Thank you.
Hi, Natapol.
Hi, Filippo.
Hi, Natapol. Thank you so much. It was such a fascinating talk. I learned a lot from it. And I have two questions. One is very easy and very straightforward. What was Bassani's political position, whether it was communist or Democrazia Cristiana, so Christian democracy or something else? And then I was wondering if you can find some connections between Bassani's work and some of the political landscape right now in Europe or in Italy. And if you think that this war for the environment was successful for saving the country, especially the northern part of the country, right? Because we know that I have some friends who still see Italy as a sort of Shire from the Lord of the Rings, a sort of a purified environment, but they get disappointed when they go to the northern part of the country and they take a train from Venice to Milan and they see that it's mostly a heavy industrialized country with power plants and steel plants and so on. And I was wondering if that connects pretty easily with what you were saying about Bassani's work, right? Thank you so much. Fascinating.
Thank you, Filippo. So for the first question, Bassani was an Italian Jew born. He was born in Bologna, but lived in Ferrara, and during the fascist period and also during the Second World War, he was a very active anti-fascist militant. So he participated in the resistance movement, and if you recall in my talk, I mentioned that he was arrested for his activism or his for his participation in the resistance movement. So I can say that he's a socialist or like lean leftist. I mean, his political stance was more like socialist or leftist, and therefore it also connects to why he was one of the co-founders of the association Italia Nostra, which, because the other founders were also anti-fascist, Bassani himself was anti-fascist, and they had this kind of common interest, common ideology, which was the anti-fascism, or the belief in the resistance movement. And this kind of ideology after the Second World War was translated into environmentalism, because which is the point that I was trying to demonstrate here, because this parallelism, or this kind of, let's say, parallelism between the anti-fascist of the Second World War and the environmentalist of the post-war period, is part of Bassani's attempt to create this narrative, this kind of new environmental narrative. And we can say that the social political climate at the time was also favorable to his attempt to draw parallelism between anti-fascists and environmentalists in order to achieve his objective as the president of the association, of the Italia Nostra association. So yeah, I think that might have answered the first question. But let me know if I was missing something. Then talking about this kind of idyllic image of nature, even I would say that even up until now, we can also consider this as some kind of rhetoric or narrative as well. The idyllic nature. We often say we often talk about the pure, or the unspoiled nature. Even nowadays, we still talk about that. But this is a narrative or rhetoric that has a very deep root in our mindset since I don't know, since a very long time, and it's a narrative that is very difficult to change, because we probably, because we want to believe that there is still the natural pureness, the idyllic, the unspoiled, the virgin nature out there for us. But and so what I can say is, this is a very difficult narrative to change, and it will require a lot of effort to change this narrative, to change people's mindset about nature or change the narrative about the unspoiledness, or the virgin land. So what I can say is that the case of Bassani's environmental narrative is an example of an attempt to kind of offer a new narrative to combat that rhetoric, because Bassani himself was in this collected in this collection of writings, Italia da Salvare. He was very vocal. He was very vocal about how Italia Nostra, how the association Italia Nostra was attacked by people saying that you are backward-looking people. You want to keep Italy as an agricultural country. You don't want new technologies. You don't want industrialization. You don't want the country to move forward. But Bassani was very vocal to say that that's not the case. That's not what Italia Nostra try to do. He was saying, he said that all these developments, all these new technologies, introduction to new technologies, development in Italy was very much welcomed by Bassani or by Italia Nostra. It's the uncontrolled development or the uncontrolled growth that Italia Nostra was trying to deal with. They're trying to slow down. They're trying to tell people that we have to. Of course, we have to look forward as a civilization, as a country, but at the same time, we cannot sacrifice natural resources, important historical town centers of Italy in the name of development or in the name of growth, economic growth. So so we still have to using Bassani vocabulary. We still have to fight. Still have to find ways to let's say balance as a civilization, as a if we want to move forward, if we want to move forward and at the same time deal with the problems that we are seeing today, which is the all those that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, okay. Climate change and everything. So
great. Thank you very much, Filippo, for the comment and the questions, or the two questions, I guess. Yes. We've reached past 5 o'clock. I am aware of everyone's time, and I know we haven't had our reading week yet. I would suggest that if anyone has any other questions or comments, you could maybe just send them. Natapol, are you open to receiving emails with questions and comments about your talk? I hope that you got to see Alison Keith before she left says, thank you so much, Natapol, for your fascinating talk. She wants to read Bassani now. She had to run another meeting. I don't want to keep other people who have other commitments as well. So on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you, Natapol, very much for your talk. Let's give him a round of applause for that. And I will also remind you that on March 9th, we have at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we have another of our NFC Doctoral Fellow Lecture Series, From Persons to Cases, the Global History of Lunacy Certificates, 1850s to 1890s, with Filippo Sposini, who happens to be here today. So great. Thank you all very much for coming out. It really means a lot that you give us your time and you help support our fellows. And I know I speak for Amelia when I say that we both really appreciate it. So thank you very much. Have a great evening and take good care. Natapol.